videotape the Know Your Records program here, so thanks for your patience. There was a big event happening at the College Park building where we usually videotape these lectures, and they just didn't have enough audiovisual support, or they did, but I didn't want to make them too rushed. So we're doing it here today, so welcome. My name's Andrea Bassing-Matney. I'm with the Customer Services Division here with the National Archives, and welcome to the Know Your Records program. We have weekly programs here, usually on Tuesdays, once a week, and it usually gets repeated on Thursdays. We flipped it around a little bit because we're having a workshop this week, tomorrow and Thursday. So hopefully we'll see you for that too. So we have workshops, and we have lectures, we have symposiums, and we also have the annual genealogy fair that's coming up on April 22nd and 23rd. You'll see flyers out and about the building. Hopefully you can come and attend that. And so today we have Damani Davis. I'm so pleased to hear his lecture. I hear it's fantastic. And we left some handouts for you, and if you have to leave early, I ask please fill out the evaluation form that was in your handout packet before you go. Those are actually tied into our budget, and it's very helpful to get that feedback. So today is Exodus to Kansas, and pardon me for reading, the 1880 Senate investigation of the beginnings of the African American migration from the South. Damani Davis examines federal records relating to the Kansas Exodus, the Exoduster movement, which was the first instance of voluntary mass migration among African Americans. This mass exodus was significant enough to generate considerable attention throughout the nation and resulted in a major Senate investigation. Damani Davis is an archivist of the National Archives Research Support Branch, Customer Services Division here in Washington, D.C. He has lectured at local, regional, and national conferences on African American history and genealogy. Damani Davis is a graduate of Coppin State College in Baltimore and received his M.A. in history at the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Today's program is approximately 1 hour long, and we hope that you enjoy it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes. Well, good morning, everyone. Exodus to Kansas, the 1880 Senate investigation of the beginnings of the African American migration from the South. I'm going to begin with a quote from that particular investigation. In the spring of 1879, thousands of colored people, unable longer to endure the intolerable hardships, injustice, and suffering inflicted upon them by a class of Democrats in the South, had in utter despair fled panic-stricken from their homes and sought protection among strangers in a strange land. Homeless, penniless, and in rags, these poor people were thronging the wharves of St. Louis, crowding the steamers on the Mississippi River, and in pitiable destitution throwing themselves upon the charity of Kansas. Thousands more were congregating along the banks of the Mississippi River, hailing the passing steamers, and imploring them for a passage to the land of freedom where the rights of citizens are respected and honest toil rewarded by honest compensation. The newspapers were filled with accounts of their destitution, and the very air was burdened with the cry of distress from a class of American citizens flying from persecutions which they could no longer endure. Now, that particular quotation comes from the minority report of that Senate investigating, meaning the two Republicans at that time who were involved. And I'll go into a deeper analysis of the Senate investigation. But before I go into that, I wanted to just put the Kansas Exodus in this historical context as far as how it relates to the overall history of African American migration. Within African American history, migration has been central to the Black experience. Many of the 20th century history was filled with that demographic and the cultural change that came with it. And in this quote, I basically say that any adequate understanding of African American history and culture must consider how migration has transformed and shaped the larger American society, African Americans as a people, and African American families in particular. When we look at mass migration in the history of African Americans, social scientists who study migration categorize it into two categories: forced migration and voluntary migration. Forced migration in the history of African Americans, of course, involved the Atlantic slave trade, the internal domestic slave trade, which in the context of American or the United States history was actually involved more people than the Atlantic slave trade, meaning in the United States history, more African Americans were sent from the upper South, Virginia, Maryland, the Chesapeake region, to the newer expanding states in the deep South, such as Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, then were actually, that number exceeds the numbers of Africans that were initially brought to the United States. Some estimate, well, the latest estimate I saw was about 1.2 million African Americans were sent from the Chesapeake region down to the expanding cotton states of the deep South. And with that entailed or involved, the breakup of families and so forth. A lot of that history was involved in that mass forced migration. Now, with voluntary migration, we have the Kansas Exodus that I'm going to go into today, the Great Migration, which began around the World War I era, and the post-World War II migration, which was involved the largest amount of individuals who migrated from the historical South to other regions of the United States. Okay. This map just shows the African American distribution in 1890, and around 1900, approximately 90%, 89% of African Americans still resided in the South. And here's just a breakdown of regional distribution. By 1970, 53% of African Americans were still in the South, whereas at the beginning of that century, 90% were concentrated in the South. The Kansas Exodus is significant in that it is the first general migration of black people after the Civil War, black Americans after the Civil War. The bulk of this presentation comes from 46th Congress, second session, report number 693 that you can find in the serial set. Report and testimony of the Select Committee of the United States Senate to investigate the causes of the removal of the Negroes from the southern states to the northern states. That involved 3 parts contained in 2 large volumes. There's much genealogical value in this Senate investigation. Within the investigation, we have recorded testimony, which includes interviews, letters, and affidavits from African American witnesses. And within those affidavits and letters are much personal and biographical information that can potentially be used by a descendant of individuals who were involved in this migration. The historical context lies in the fact that this testimony provides abundant information that gives insight into the lives, struggles, experiences, values, ideals, and aspirations of African Americans living during the post-Reconstruction period. So any family historian who wants to flesh out and have like a broader context of what the ancestor might have experienced during this period, within the investigation, you can see a lot of their concerns expressed within the testimony. Okay. Now, an example of how genealogical data can be found throughout the investigation. Here's an example of the testimony of John O'Kelly. John O'Kelly was actually a resident of North Carolina, and towards the tail end of the migration from the Gulf states to Kansas, a newer migration began from North Carolina to Indiana. And so that migration was also included in the investigation. But here we have his testimony given during his questioning. The senator asks, "Where's your residence?" He responds, "Raleigh, North Carolina." "What is your professional business?" "I am doing a livery business." "Do you own any property or real estate?" "Yes, sir. I own some outside of the corporation of the town, and I've got a house and home. You were formerly a slave? Yes, sir, I used to belong to General Cox. How much property at a round guess are you worth now? I don't know, sir, but I would not tonight take less than 5,000 for what I've got. Have you made all of that as a free man? Yes, sir, I had nothing at the time of the surrender. Okay, now, from that testimony, a potential descendant can get all of that information in regards to John O'Kelly. Okay. Another example that's contained within this investigation. This is from the testimony of Julius A. Bonnets. Now, Julius Bonnets was actually a white resident of North Carolina who was called to the investigation. And within the investigation, you're going to see a lot of the testimony falling on two different sides of the political extreme. Some were trying to minimize what was occurring in the South at that time, and others were focused on highlighting what was occurring with the hopes that federal troops could return to the South. So from Julius Bonnet's perspective, what he's arguing here is that in his area of North Carolina, there are actually African Americans who are prospering, which is also true. There are various experiences that are occurring at this time. But here he says, I know a colored man living near Mount Olive, 12 miles from Goldsboro, North Carolina, who is the owner of 316 acres of land. His name is Calvin Simmons. He has, within the last year or two, finished paying for the plantation. He bought it some years ago on long time at the rate of $10 an acre. He paid for it himself and his boys with what they raised from it. In my own town, there is a man named William Bernard, who is a man who owns a fine house and lot. Not long ago, I offered him $1,000 for his place, but he refused it on the grounds that he did not need the money. It's well located, a valuable piece, and increasing in value every year. To confirm the testimony that was given by Julius Bonnets, I checked our census records, and sure enough, I found Calvin Simmons in the census. In this 1900 census, it does state whether the individual was the owner or not of their property. In this particular census, it has Calvin Simmons listed as a renter. It doesn't mention that he owned his property, but that, potential descendant would check other documents to confirm whether the testimony is in fact true or what the census might, be mistaken. Now, with William Bernard, the other individual who was mentioned, his census record does confirm that he was the owner of his property in North Carolina. Okay. Now, going into the beginnings of the Kansas Exodus, in the Senate investigation, there was much testimony given that described a major convention movement occurring amongst African Americans during that time. Here I have a list of some of the conventions that were held during the 1870s, and this doesn't cover all of the conventions. These were the ones that were mentioned in the Senate investigation. There were two in Alabama, one in 1872, another in 1874, a colored convention in Arkansas in 1877, a convention in Louisiana, 1879, Nashville, Tennessee in 1879, and Houston, Texas in 1879. And at each of these conventions, the idea of migration as a tactical response to what was occurring, with the end of Reconstruction, with the removal of federal troops and so forth, that the idea of migration came up in each of those conventions. So that kind of goes against the idea that, the migration was spontaneous, or, when you look at some of the descriptions of the migration, it's kind of categorized as something that happened spur of the moment, and there was no planning. It was the migrants were basically manipulated by outsiders and so forth. But with these conventions, we see that the idea of migration was something that was actually discussed. The question was, where could African Americans go? That was the fundamental question that was debated at these conventions. Okay, let me go back here. Now, at the with these conventions, I just included some of the statements and resolutions that were made at these conventions, so that we can get an idea of the debate and an idea of what was occurring at that time. At the 1872 Alabama Convention, the participants expressed the desire to try to accumulate homes or property as fast as possible. Throughout the testimony, you see this desire of African Americans to gain property. And what you see here is still that hope that was, reflect or kind of showed earlier with the whole idea of 40 acres and a mule and so forth. During this time, the ideal that many black Southerners are holding on to is the hope that they could gain land, gain their own property, and become, self-sufficient, independent, and autonomous, basically. And that's an ideal that is expressed throughout the testimony. They had their ideal kind of fell in lines with the characteristics of a yeoman farmer. Like that was their ideal at this time, to become yeoman farmers, where they would have their own land, raise their own crops, be self-sufficient, and so forth. So a lot of the conflict at this time is going to occur when this desire for land ownership meets this new system, this new sharecropping system that is going to be instituted in the South. So many of the African Americans are going to resist the idea of becoming sharecroppers. So in this early period, they're still resisting it and going through this whole conflict. Here in the 1872 convention, within this last paragraph, it says, "Work honestly and hard for the consummation of those objects. Do everything in your power to secure these," meaning land ownership, the rights of citizenship, and so forth. And if those efforts fail, they said that it's time to desert Alabama and seek a land or a state where these rights are accorded. In the 1874 convention, we have some of the same sentiments expressed. In this last paragraph here, we see that our race have now met in convention to consider solemnly the question of their future destiny in this state and in this country. We have no reason to expect from our political opponents, now dominant in the state, the exercise of justice, mercy, or wise policy. The solemn question with us is, shall we be compelled to repeat the history of the Israelites and go into exile from the land of our nativity and our home, to seek new homes and fields of enterprise beyond the reign and rule of Pharaoh, using a lot of the allusions to the Bible and so forth, which was also prevalent in a lot of the rhetoric during this time. 1879 Colored Men's Convention at Nashville. A major complaint at that convention, goes again to the new sharecropping system that is being instituted. There are complaints of farmers or sharecroppers being cheated out of their wages or their crops and so forth. They did not have the opportunity to get the results of their labor as they thought they should have, and so forth. And in falling into debt each year, at the beginning of each year, they thought it necessary now to make some change, and they thought they might find some change in immigration, meaning migration. Now, Benjamin Pap Singleton was one of the major figures of the Kansas migration. In his testimony, when asked for his motive in seeking colonies in Kansas, or seeking to establish black colonies, he said, "Well, my people for the want of land. We needed land for our children. Their disadvantages caused my heart to grieve and sorrow. Pity for my race, sir, that was coming down instead of going up. That caused me to go to work for them. This was gotten up by colored men in purity and confidence. Not a political Negro was in it. Oh no, it was the muscle of the arm, the men that worked that we wanted." And within Benjamin Pap Singleton's testimony, what we see here is he's making a clear attempt to separate his movement from any type of outside influence, because that was an accusation that was being made by some of the politicians. They argued that, these people clearly are being manipulated by politicians and so forth. But Benjamin Singleton is saying that no, this is really a grassroots movement, and he's trying to facilitate a desire that was expressed amongst his people. Here's just some more of Benjamin Singleton's testimony. He says, with this migration, part of his attempt was to learn the South a lesson. One of the senators asked him, suppose the white people were to treat them well, speaking of African Americans in the South, or Benjamin Singleton's community. Suppose they were treated well and were given their rights as American citizens and given what they earned. Would not that stop the exodus? He answered, allow me to say to you that confidence has perished and faded away. They have been lied to every year. We don't want to leave the South, and just as soon as we have confidence in the South, I'm going to be an instrument in the hands of God to persuade every man to go back, because that is the best country. That is genial to our nature. We love that country, and it is the best country in the world for us, but we are going to learn the South a lesson. You believe then there's no way to stop the exodus except by stopping the abuse of these people, by treating them fairly, and that it will take some time to get their confidence even then. They will go back. I have heard some say they will never go back, but they will go back. Another major figure in the migration to Kansas was Henry Adams. Henry Adams was an Army veteran, and within his state of Louisiana, he and other black veterans formed an organization originally called the Colored Men's Protective Union, which consisted of approximately 500 members. And what they initially attempted to do was investigate the living conditions of black field workers in various southern states. Henry Adams claims that they enrolled over 98,000 names of black field workers who were interested in leaving the South. Most of the names collected were from Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas, with a minority of names from Mississippi, Alabama, and a few other states. Henry Adams, within his testimony, he stated that he was an Army veteran. So I checked our records here to confirm that, and what I have here is Henry Adams' military service record, confirming that he indeed had served in the Army, in the regular Army. Okay. And I have here Henry Adams' Freedmen's Bank record that gives his physical description, his residence at that time was Shreveport, Louisiana. It also provides the name of his mother, his parents, and his siblings, and gives his place of birth, Jasper County, Georgia, and his occupation as a wood chopper. Now, I included that record to show how potentially a descendant of any of these individuals can find records here at the National Archives that can provide, a great deal of information. And the Freedmen's Bank record itself, the idea of looking for that was kind of given to me from the testimony itself, because a major complaint given by some of the migrants, especially in Louisiana, was based on or focused on the money that they lost when the Freedmen's Bank fell. That was a major complaint. Some were asking to be reimbursed for the money that they lost. Now, Henry Adams' organization compiled a list of what they call outrages in Louisiana that occurred from 1866 to 1876. And this gives, more insight into some of the violence that occurred during a period in which the South, was being redeemed, by the Democrats during that period. And here's just an example of some of the incidents. This list actually occurs of over 600 incidents that were recorded. Example, Frank Hayes, colored, was badly beaten and all of his crops taken from him, about 6 or 8 miles northeast of Port Hudson. On Frank Vu's plantation, and Mr. Frank Vu was captain of the crowd of all white men who done it, all white men, 1876. William Henry hung dead by a large crowd of white men about 4 miles east of St. Martinsville because he refused to let them take his crop. This was done December 1875. William Monroe, colored, was shot and badly wounded for voting a Republican ticket. He was shot by armed white men in the year 1874. Samuel Smith badly whipped and bloodied by Captain Scott because he went to church without his consent. Then they made him run away and leave his crop, done July 4th, 1875. All of that type of testimony was given to, by Henry Adams' organization to basically provide evidence or information to show why they desired to leave their particular state. George T. Ruby was actually an African-American Northerner who moved south after the Civil War in order to help with some of the activities of the Freedmen's Bureau. He was a Freedmen's Bureau agent, later became a state senator in Texas, and upon the redemption of Texas, he moved to Louisiana and began to work as a educator. But when the level of violence began to really rise in Louisiana, he joined Henry Adams' movement to try to assist it. And I included some of his statements regarding the atmosphere during that period in Louisiana. Here he says, "The only remedy left to colored citizens in many parishes of our state today is to immigrate. There are sections of Louisiana where the condition of things is such that the very best thing that could be done for all concerned would be for the colored people to leave and go away entirely." Okay. And here he goes more into it, speaking on, "It's pregnant that we do not enjoy those certain inalienable rights which the Constitution has given us. We have, as American citizens, been citizens indeed in word, and have performed the part or role assigned to us with loyalty, and we now ask the government to see to it that we have given to us what the Constitution awards. We have been liberated only to become worse enslaved. Law and equity in the South are not for the black man. Hence, this attempt to better our condition by migration is the only solace left us. We have counted the cost of this movement. We know that it is improvident for some of us, but why hesitate between two evils? We will accept the lesser of the two and trust God for deliverance from further evil. If we remain here, we will have to undergo the same merciless treatment endured by us on the eve of every election, as well as being defrauded out of all we earn by the sweat of our brows. Liberty to the Negro in the South is a mockery." And here I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this is just a letter that the Colored Men's Convention in Louisiana sent to President Hayes at that time. And hopefully it's in your handouts, it's clear enough for you to read. But basically, he's there in this letter, they're explaining again some of the violence and so forth and some of their grievances at that time. The letter to Rutherford B. Hayes included 3 resolutions, again asking that their rights guaranteed to them be restored and that they have protection. Asking that Congress restore back to them the savings that were lost to them by the failure of the Freedmen's Bank, and asking again for political protection, that we as a race will abstain from voting on all national questions and at elections for national officers unless we have full protection in our own officers to guard our interests and rights and so forth. Now, for any who are interested in a more detailed investigation of what was occurring in the South at that time, I just included an earlier investigation, which was the use of the Army in certain of the southern states, during 1876. In that investigation, which was around the time of, the Compromise of 1877, when, as part of Rutherford B. Hayes gaining the presidency, it was kind of agreed that federal troops would be removed out of the South. Before that, around the time that occurred, the House of Representatives asked that all correspondence between the former president and military commanders in the South be given or transmitted to the House of Representatives. And within that particular investigation, there's a detailed list of, the reasons that the Army was being kept in certain states such as Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida especially. And through there, it goes through a lot of the violence and so forth that was occurring. O.S.B. Wall was the president of the Immigrant Aid Society here in Washington, D.C. Osby Wall was actually a highly educated African American who had served as an officer with the Union Army during the Civil War. And after the Civil War, he worked in the Freedmen's Bureau as a transportation agent. Later, during the Kansas Exodus, he formed the Immigrant Aid Society, which intended to assist those who were trying to migrate to Kansas. And he was also called to give testimony at the investigation. Again, just using him as an example, I got his Freedmen's Bank record, which provides his physical description and the names of members of his family, place of birth, and so forth. And at the time that he made his Freedmen's Bank deposit, he was still in employment of the Freedmen's Bureau. Also, from the records finding that he was a transportation agent for the Freedmen's Bureau, I found some of his particular records where here in the Washington, D.C. area, where so many freedmen were coming from the outlying areas of Virginia and Maryland into D.C., one of the activities of the Freedmen's Bureau at that time was to try to find employment for some of this population and provide transportation to them north, and especially to areas such as Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, and also Ohio. So, and that's something that he did prior to the Kansas Exodus. So when the Kansas Exodus began, he basically kind of resumed some of that activity that he had experience with as a Freedmen's Bureau agent. Now, throughout the testimony, only men are called as witnesses. So if you just take the testimony at face value, you would assume only men or males were involved in the Kansas Exodus. But within the testimony, we have this from John Henry Birch, who was another educated African American in Louisiana who was called to give testimony. And speaking on the influence of women in the Louisiana movement, he says, the women have had more to do with it than all the politics and men in the country. They have been very active since 1868 in all the political movements. They form a large number in all the political assemblages, and they have evidenced a deep interest in all that pertains to politics. There's in New Orleans today a committee formed in 1878 that was called the Committee of 500 Women, of which Mrs. Mary J. Garnett is president. Her name now is Mary Jane Nelson. She married this year. Now, in Louisiana, what this suggests is that at the same time that Henry Adams had his organization, the Colored Men's Protective Union, which later became the Colonization Council, simultaneous with that, you had women who had their own organization in Louisiana that was also involved in working in coordination with the men. Okay. Now we're going to go into some of the records that focus specifically on the Kansas Exodus. Here I just have a map that shows sort of the path that was taken by many of the migrants. Now, that first quote that I gave at the beginning, that description does pertain to some of the migrants, but not all of them. You have two major groups of migrants at this time. In states such as Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and so forth, they began a movement a little bit earlier to Kansas, which kind of resembles the general movement west of all Americans at that time. You know, like the tradition of the pioneers that we have, where individuals move west to get land. Benjamin Pap Singleton's movement falls in that category. With them, they kind of had long-term planning. They organized it. They located land in Kansas that they felt would be a good location, and they saved money and so forth, and moved across from Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, and so forth to St. Louis, and then traveled on across to Kansas and formed colonies. What's going to occur in the Gulf states with the redemption of states such as Louisiana and Mississippi is the level of violence at that time is going to be so extreme that the second category is just going to leave almost with just the clothes on their backs. A lot of them are going to, I guess, fall into the category of almost war refugees, where they're fleeing, a concerted and systematic type of violence against them and terrorism, which was basically used to intimidate and force African Americans out of, the political system at that time. So especially with Louisiana's redemption that is occurring, many of them, when they hear about this idea of Kansas as a place that, African Americans can get land and form colonies, many of them are just going to flee or steamships up to St. Louis and then travel across Missouri on to Kansas to get land. So with them, they kind of fall into into the description of that quote that was given at the beginning. Here's just another photo of Benjamin Pap Singleton and some of the migrants who were going to his colonies on the steamship. Okay. Some of the black towns and settlements that were formed in Kansas are listed here. The only one that I know of that still exists today is Nicodemus, Graham County, Kansas. Some of the other ones eventually died. Some became, incorporated into larger nearby communities such as Topeka and other towns and so forth, and now they're kind of became neighborhoods within larger jurisdictions and so forth. But these towns were formed throughout Kansas. And then later, many individuals are going to move on to Oklahoma and other parts of the West, but especially Oklahoma is going to be the site of, I guess the largest number of black towns and settlements in the West during that period. But Kansas is the initial state that many of these migrants are going to. And many ask me, why Kansas? During this time, during the 1870s, the idea of Kansas became idealized as, the home. They looked at it as the home or the native, what they felt was the home of John Brown and the home of certain free state sentiments prior to the Civil War and so forth. So with all of that, the idea of Kansas as a place that will be welcoming is going to really come to the forefront during this time. Okay. Here I just have some of the records of individuals. Well, this particular individual was one of the colonists at Benjamin Singleton's colony in Dunlap, Kansas. I found this individual in a census record and used him as an example of how other records can be found once, a name and so forth is found. I located Henry Stewart in our tract books for Morris County, Kansas. And within our tract books, we were given a legal description of the land. With the legal description, you can then go find the land case files, which can provide you with more information on the settler. After getting the land case files, I got here from the Topeka Land Office, the certificate showing that Stewart had purchased the lot at that particular colony. Here's just an early town site plan for Nicodemus, Kansas that I included, and a print map of Nicodemus, Kansas from 1906. Now, Zachary T. Fletcher and Jenny Smith Fletcher were migrants from Kentucky initially who settled in Nicodemus Colony. I found their pictures at from the Library of Congress's collection. I got their pictures as settlers of Nicodemus, and since I had their pictures, I just adopted them as my imaginary ancestors and used them as a case study of how records can be found here at the National Archives. And I did that just because I had their pictures. Now, using this Fletcher family, I first went to our census records and found them in the 1880 census for Nicodemus, Kansas. And here we have the family. I know you can't see it clearly, but it has Zachary T. Fletcher as the postmaster for Nicodemus, Kansas, along with his wife Frances and the two children, Thomas and Josephine. Okay. After going to the census records, I went into our tract books for Graham County, Kansas, and found the Fletcher's legal description of his land, the legal description of his land. And from there, I was able to locate his land case files. And here's his homestead, his original homestead affidavit for the land that he has settled upon. And for homesteads, basically the settler just had to make improvements upon that land, and upon proving that, the necessary improvements were made, the settler will be awarded the land by the government. And in his affidavits, basically, he's making his case that he has made improvements upon the land. Here he says, I am now residing on the land I desire to enter, and I've made a bona fide improvement and settlement thereon. That said, settlement was commenced about February 10th, 1881, and that my improvements consist of a dugout, a stone house under erection, and 50 acres of breaking. Okay. Here we have more information saying Zachary T. Fletcher, or Z.T. Fletcher, being first duly sworn, claimed settlement on the 25th day, July 1882, and I have been with my family on said land at various times, but have not made continuous residence on the account of being appointed and commissioned postmaster of Nicodemus, Graham County, Kansas. I also placed thereon my soldier's homestead entry that I was a private of Captain John Cook, Company B, 8th Regiment of the United States Colored Artillery, as shown by a copy of my discharge. I further swear that owing to my financial affairs, the severe drought causing an entire failure of my crops during the first 2 years of my filing and entry, and poor health of my wife, I was unable to keep my family on said land. In consideration of my services as a soldier and postmaster of Nicodemus, Kansas, my cultivation and improvements on said land, I make this affidavit to the commissioner to complete my title to said land. Okay. To all whom these present shall come greeting, whereas on the 14th day, April 1884, Zachary T. Fletcher was appointed postmaster at Nicodemus, Kansas, just giving proof that he was, or documentation that he was the postmaster of Nicodemus, Kansas. And at some point, Zachary Fletcher lost his discharge documents. So he received a soldier's certificate that proved that he has served in the military. And his soldier's certificate says, know ye that this is to certify that Zachary Fletcher, private of Captain John Cook's Company B, 8th Regiment, United States Colored Artillery, volunteers, who was enrolled on the 16th day of June, 1864, to serve 3 years during the war, was honorably discharged from the military service of the United States on the 10th day of February, 1866, at Victoria, Texas. Okay. Now, from the information gathered from his land records, we see that he's served in the military. So logically, we would search for his military records, and that's what I have here. This is the outside covering of his military service records, confirming that he has served in the 8th U.S. Colored Artillery. And these are just the first two cards, the first and the last cards of his service records, giving a physical description and his muster out information, or discharge information. Okay. Now with Zachary Fletcher, going from the military service records, I looked into check to see whether he had a military pension file, military pension records. And within his pension records, Zachary Fletcher provided an autobiographical type letter to try to prove who he was, because again, when you consider pension records, basically the veteran had to prove, or in the case that the veteran was dead, the widow had to prove that the veteran had indeed served in the military and was the person that the veteran was claiming to be, and so forth. So here, he's basically given as much information that he has on himself and his history to prove that he is indeed Zachary Fletcher and deserving of his military pension. And within the letter, he says, Your Honor, my dear sir, I being raised a slave, I have no record of my age, and if there is any, I do not know anything of it. My first master was a bachelor, and he died when I was a baby, and willed all of his slaves to his sister Mary, who had married a man by the name of Anthony Robb. She died in a few years, and we were all divvied out with her children. And we never all got together until after the war. In the year 1856 to 57, I was bound out to a man by the name of Isaac Davis as a race rider. I guess he raced horses, that's what I assume, as a race rider. He died in 1863. I stayed with his family until June 1864, at which time I joined the Army. And 2 days later, my mistress, Mrs. Ellen Davis, came into my camp and tried to get me out on the grounds that I would not be 19 years old until the 12th of August of the same year. But as I had on my uniform and had been sworn in, she could not get me out. Next, I went to see my father just before he died in 1913, and he told me that I was born August 12, 1845, the same year that Zachary Taylor fought the Mexican War, and that my master, Robert Fletcher, being of the same political party, named me after him, Zachary Taylor Fletcher. The above is the best mostly that I can give you of my age, as all of my old white people and all of my brothers and sisters of 10 are dead. Mother died when I was 9 years old, and my father died 3 years ago at the age of 93. We colored slaves knew nothing of the census, and all of the above acts was in McCracken County, Kentucky, 5 miles west of Paducah, Kentucky, sorry. So basically, with his military pension records, all of this information was provided, given the names of his former owners, place of birth, family members, an approximate date of when he was born. Remember, many, ex-slaves did not know their birth dates because those type of records just weren't kept and so forth. So all of that information was provided in this pension file and can be of good use to a potential descendant. Okay. And in closing, I will say speaking of the social and cultural ramifications of migration, the movement of individuals and families from one place to another produces a wide variety of changes, and the individuals and families involved in the sending and receiving communities, and in the larger areas of which the sending and receiving communities are a part of. That's actually a quote from Black Migration: A Social Demographic History. Okay. The Kansas Exodus is important, in particular the investigation of it, in that within that testimony, a lot of the later problems, a lot of the social conditions, a lot of the grievances experienced by African Americans were already being highlighted or already being experienced. When you look at some of the documents, such as from the Department of Labor, with their investigation of the migration, the beginning of the Great Migration around World War I period, a lot of the reasons behind that migration is basically going to be the same as a lot of the grievances expressed in the testimony of the Kansas Exodus, meaning that from the period of this migration to the Great Migration, which began in the 20th century, in the teens, basically the same problems experienced by African Americans in the South are going to continue, and basically are going to become, codified and systematized as the Jim Crow system. So the desire for education and so forth is the desire for freedom from violence, the desire for, the opportunity to have political participation and so forth. A lot of that is going to be expressed later during the World War I period. The only difference is during the Kansas migration, the African Americans are still holding on to that desire for land, the desire to own their own land. They still desire to be farmers, sufficient independent farmers and so forth. By the time of the Great Migration, the ideal of becoming farmers is somewhat going to be diminished somewhat, At that time, the desire is going to be for better paying jobs, because by that point, they're now basically, for the most part, not all, but the masses of African Americans in the South were in the sharecropping system by that point. So instead of being sharecroppers, many are going to desire to find better employment. And during the period of the First World War, that's going to open up in northern cities when the migration from Europe is cut off because of the war, and the need for labor is going to lead to recruiters going to the South, and then it's going to become a self-perpetuating migration that continues throughout most of the 20th century after the Second World War, and basically it's going to reverse itself after 1970. From 1970 and increasing each decade from that point, the numbers of African Americans actually migrating from other regions to the South has increased each decade, even more so now, and that's increased, even more in the 2000s. Okay. And in closing, in the post-Reconstruction era, numerous African Americans began to view migration as a legitimate option and tactical choice to gain those aspects of freedom and human rights or civil rights that had been stripped from them in the South. It was a grassroots movement that was organized by field laborers despite opposition from many leading members of the educated black elite at that time. And even Frederick Douglass was opposed to the migration. He was holding on to the hope that the federal government would, send troops back into the South and protect, Southerners, black Southerners who were trying to engage in the political process. They sought economic independence through land ownership, education, political freedom, security from violence, and religious and social freedom, along with the chance to build and maintain a strong family life. This migration highlights their own unique pursuit of happiness in America. All of this is expressed in their testimony. Okay. Any questions? Yes.
Is there an index to the committee report?
Yeah, well, there's an index of the names of witnesses.
Oh, yeah.
Within the serial set volume. All of the witnesses called are indexed for each part of the volume. There are 3 parts of the investigation, and for each part, it has its own name index.
And there are bibliographies or biographies of each?
It has a short description of the person.
And what about index by state?
No index by state. But it does, within the name index, sometimes it does have the state of that person, but there's no separate state index. Just a name index and a brief description, very brief description of the person. Yes.
When you're looking at the Kansas settlements, black settlements in Kansas, did you run across Fort Scott, Kansas?
I don't recall it specifically, but many of the settlements weren't. There were many settlements that I didn't include on that list that I had. Just some of the ones that were mentioned within, some of the documents that I was looking at. But for the settlements, there are more than I had in the presentation itself. Those were just an example. And even the conventions that I mentioned, there were more conventions held in the 1870s than those that I showed. But, that the black colony movement is going to occur throughout that period, throughout Kansas, and expand into Oklahoma, where even more of them are going to be established, and in other states in the West during that period.
Is there any centralized record of where those black settlements in Kansas were in your research?
No federal records. None in the federal records. Okay. Yes.
My family moved from Missouri. Well, they were here in Culpeper County, and then part of them sort of was sent to Missouri, and then that group moved to Kansas.
Okay.
They started practicing this area.
Okay.
And about what year?
Now for places like Missouri, Tennessee, with Benjamin Pap Singleton's group, Kentucky, some of those settlements and some of those colonists actually moved prior to the 1870s. Some began at, even in the 1860s, towards the the latter half of the 1860s, and continue on through the 70s. It's just in the 1870s, the number of migrants is really gonna, increase substantially because of the situation in the South at that time. That's gonna kind of motivate many who might not have, desired to migrate before to now migrate as a reaction to what's occurring in the South. But for those from Missouri, a lot of them, were part of that group that really organized and, had, more long-term plans for, their settlement and so forth, and in terms of, going to Kansas and getting the land and so forth, and having, some resources when they made the move. you know. Yes.
You had mentioned that Kansas was like the first site of the mass migration, and then but Oklahoma ended up with more black towns. My father was actually born in Foley, Oklahoma, one of the black towns, and then his family moved to Wichita. So it seems like it's the opposite. Can you explain why why they started going more to Oklahoma than to Kansas?
Oklahoma. Now, don't quote me on this, but from the reading, and I'll look into that again. But I think during that period, Oklahoma is going to have some type of incentives for getting land and so forth. And from that point, a lot of the motivation is going to move towards Oklahoma, just from the practical aspect of it. Whatever those incentives were, I can't recall them specifically right now. But there's the opportunity to get land in Oklahoma is going to make that an attractive alternative. And by that time, the situation in Kansas had reached a saturation point. There wasn't as much land to get anymore. By that time, the romanticized ideal of Kansas had diminished somewhat, and Oklahoma is going to arise as a major alternative. Some other states also, but mainly Oklahoma. But I guess, a lot of the movement is going to be, based on the individuals, own desires and opportunities also. So I know, there'll be instances of, a person moving from, one state to another based on, opportunity that might have presented itself and so forth.
So should I look at Oklahoma State documents to kind of get an idea if they did provide some incentives?
Yes. And if I can, if I can get your email address, if I, just go back and look through my own notes, and I can just send you anything that I come across. Yes.
Okay, what did you find most intriguing while doing your research? What really stood out to you? Was there anything in particular, or did you really see trends?
I found there was a lot that I found intriguing, from individuals to just information that I wasn't aware of. Like for instance, the convention movement. I hadn't come across that in any of my history classes or whatever. I knew about an earlier convention movement in the North during the 1700s amongst free blacks, but a convention movement in the South during the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction period I wasn't aware of. And also the idea of migration being so heavily debated, amongst African Americans in an organized way. I wasn't aware of that, because from a lot of the secondary material of the Exoduster movement, some of the early materials categorized it as, just a spontaneous type of movement, almost like cattle or something, a stampede, that the people weren't really thinking about what they were doing. There was political manipulation behind these poor people who didn't know better. But through the testimony, through individuals and, other forms of evidence such as the conventions, you see that it was something that was, greatly debated and organized, and the individuals made the decisions regardless of what their so-called leaders felt about it. Because some of the biggest leaders at that point still thought that, or still hoped that, blacks could maintain political participation and political power in the South, and so from Frederick Douglass's perspective, since blacks as a population were concentrated in the South, that would be the best place for them to maintain, political, influence or political power, and also economic power, just to remain there, and hopefully things would get better, at some point. But throughout the testimony of those who were involved in the migration, many of them weren't formally educated individuals, but they were individuals who had gained like a form of informal education, I guess I would call it, such as Henry Adams. Many of them were veterans. They had served in the military. They had learned to read while they were in the military. You had self-taught individuals. Benjamin Singleton was actually a person who had escaped from slavery during slavery. He escaped to Canada from Tennessee, later moved to Detroit. And then after the Civil War, when slavery was over, he moved back to his hometown in Tennessee. And in Tennessee, he was a respected person in that community amongst African Americans because he was a skilled worker. He was a carpenter. He made coffins, and he was a coffin maker and an undertaker. So he had various skills, various jobs, and just the general respect amongst people in the community. And it was through his job as an undertaker and coffin maker that he was kind of inspired to just form this colony movement, because part of that occupation required that he, get the bodies of individuals who died as a result of violence and so forth. So after seeing that, he, came up with the idea, well, probably we should just leave and go form colonies where we can gain land in peace and not become sharecroppers and, dependent on someone else and so forth. So that's going to kind of motivate him. But they fell into the class of individuals who were kind of self-taught, self-educated, and they did not come from that organized or the formally educated community, And even George Ruby, who I quoted in Louisiana, he was someone who was very educated, but throughout his testimony, he said that he only came to assist a movement that was already occurring because he had drawn the same conclusions that they had drawn for themselves. And he felt that he could use his education and his ability to write and so forth to just assist them and word the letters and so forth the way they wanted to and send it to the president and so forth. But it wasn't a movement that came from someone above and, manipulating it from the top down. It wasn't that type of movement, Thank you. Yes.
I just wondered, where was the increase in the number of discriminatory rates about colored fountains, colored schools, not riding buses, and the Ku Klux Klan during this period of time? Maybe that didn't move toward that direction.
See, that's gonna come later. What we have now is kind of that conflict where the troops have just recently been removed from the South, because of the Compromise of 1877. The deal that was made was that there was a contested election in 1876 where the compromise that was decided was that Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, would be allowed to, get the White House if the federal troops were removed from the South. So that was a compromise that everyone could agree upon. So by the time of the Senate investigation, the political will is already gone as far as protecting, African Americans in the South. At this time, the political mood is just moving on from the Civil War and the division in the nation and trying to bring everyone together and move forward. And part of that required, just leaving, the African Americans to the will of, their neighbors in the South. And now, during this period, the question is, okay, how amongst African Americans, okay, how do we respond to this? What do we do about it? Do we wait and hope that, troops are returned to the South? Do we submit to our new role as sharecroppers and, which many of them characterize as just a new form of slavery where they're dependent, and with that they'll have to give up on their dream of owning their own land and own farms and so forth? Or do they leave the South and go somewhere where they will be allowed to pursue their own desires, and their own form of citizenship and so forth? So all of this is happening. Kansas comes up as, perhaps a place that they could, go. As earlier, there were even some who were entertaining the idea of going to Liberia. They had given up completely that there was anywhere in the continental United States that will be hospitable to them. But with Kansas, when that idea kind of spreads, that's going to be the new focus. And later, some are going to move to other areas in the West. But when gradually the whole movement is going to cease, because when it reaches a saturation point in these places and so forth, the motivation to go there is not going to be to the same extent when it doesn't live up to everyone's ideals and so forth. So for a period of years, the masses of African Americans are going to submit. Not really, I don't want to use that